welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share stories about obscure cryptids, with this one featuring Thunderbirds and Indrid Cold, also known as the Smiling Man or the Grinning Man. These stories include a couple who saw not only a Thunderbird but also a UFO nearby, two people who had a smiling man watching them in their homes, with one being followed from home to home, and a young woman who saw a strange figure with a maniacal grin walking across the street before it supposedly showed up at her apartment on Halloween. But first, we start with a young man who had 3 different encounters with Thunderbirds. If you've never heard of either of these cryptids, don't worry. I will explain each, as well as include a link to the web pages where I found that information in the description below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. I don't really see a lot of Thunderbird stories and have wanted to include them on this channel for some time, so when I decided to start doing videos about more obscure cryptids, I had the perfect opportunity to do just that. According to the website Cryptid Wiki, a Thunderbird is a cryptozoological creature associated with large bird-like animals that live anywhere from northern Canada and Alaska down to Central America. Similar animals often appear in Native American mythology. Some tales tell of enormous eagles strong enough to carry whales on their backs to their nests. Since pioneers began moving west across the North American plains, sights of large birds have been reported. Similar stories appear from civilizations around the world. The website goes on to explain that native tribes all across North America, especially along the Pacific coast and in the Great Lakes area, have stories depicting enormous birds of prey. Some stories told that these birds were so large and powerful that when they flapped their wings, thunder was created. Lightning flashed out of their eyes and water fell off their backs, creating rain. The tribes used Thunderbirds to explain some of the things that happened naturally, such as storms and other forms of weather. Sightings of large bird-like creatures have been reported for many years, at least since people began settling further west in the United States and Canada. One of the most famous reports is from 1890, when 2 Arizona cowboys claimed to have shot and killed a large bird. It was described as having no feathers and it had a head similar to that of an alligator. The 2 men supposedly dragged the dead bird back to town after killing it. The report seems to suggest that this creature looked more like a pterodactyl or a dragon than any modern-day bird. Today, cryptozoologists usually refer to Thunderbird legends in the same way as any flying cryptids, such as the Kongamato, the Roc, the Ropin, and even sometimes the Jersey Devil. These flying creatures are often associated with modern-day pterosaurs. Many of the encounters with the creatures, including the Thunderbirds, are all described similarly. Quite often, the creatures are said to resemble pterosaurs, which were thought to be extinct for millions of years. The first story of this episode comes to us from Louisiana, where one poster had 3 separate encounters with what he believes was either a Thunderbird, a harpy eagle, or something else entirely. He took to the internet to share his stories, which took place back in 2020. The original poster, or OP, decided he wanted to share his encounters, which took place only a few months before he posted his story. As previously mentioned, he lives in Louisiana, where he came across these incredibly large and peculiar birds. Each bird he encountered had a distinct appearance, leaving him perplexed. The initial sighting took place in April of 2020 when he was visiting relatives in Clinton, Louisiana. While watching a group of turkey vultures soaring high above, his attention was drawn to another bird flying in the distance. This bird had a grayish hue with a white belly adorned with black specks. It was roughly the same size as the vultures and was clutching what he believed to be an armadillo in its talons. The first thing that caught his attention was how remarkably different the bird looked from a typical vulture. Apart from its slightly grayish body, its head was unlike any vulture he had ever encountered. Although smaller in size, its beak resembled that of a more predatory bird, and its eyes were surprisingly large, reminiscent of a sea eagle, according to the OP. This thing's facial features were practically identical, although they were barely discernible. Moreover, its wings stuck out to him as they looked powerful. They were wide and sturdy, giving him the impression that this bird was very strong. No more than a month later, he had his second encounter. One day in May, he spotted an enormous bird perched by the roadside. This creature was even more impressive than the first, and even though he only caught a glimpse of it from the back, he did see a portion of its face. He says confidently that it didn't belong to any known species. From behind, it resembled a harpy eagle, but there was a significant difference. Besides, harpy eagles are not found in Louisiana, and this bird was even larger, with a remarkably elongated beak. When he says elongated, he means like a heron or egret. He describes it as if someone had taken a harpy eagle and stretched its face. His third encounter with these giant birds was, according to him, his most uncomfortable. He had returned to his relative's house and was minding his own business when suddenly two ominous-looking birds appeared. They looked to be a pair, but the one he thought to be the female was absolutely massive compared to the male. Both birds were bigger than any vulture or heron he had ever seen. They soared above the trees, almost as if they were in search of their next meal. It was how they were flying along with their size that made him feel uneasy. These creatures were gigantic, with a wingspan that he estimates to be about 9 or 10 to 13 feet wide. But what really got to him was the way they flapped their wings. He says it was different than any other bird he had ever seen. It was slow yet powerful and sent shivers down his spine. He knew they would be able to seriously hurt someone if they had the inclination to do so. The stories he shared are just a few of the weird experiences he has had in the area, and he does say that he continued to catch glimpses of the birds from his first encounter a few more times. Most people who have cryptid encounters are usually unlucky enough to just have one, but to see possible Thunderbirds on 3 different occasions? That's some really bad luck. Now, I'll be honest, the first encounter could have been a regular bird that just looked odd from a distance. He even says it looked to be the same size as the other vultures in the area at the time. Thunderbirds are said to be a lot larger than what he described that one as being. But the second and third encounters, especially the third, he describes birds that were a lot larger than normal. And for them to look like species not found in the area where he lives makes it even weirder. The good thing they didn't see him, being that he said they looked like they were in search of their next meal. One thing that caught my attention during his third encounter was how he described the wing flapping as being powerful and giving him chills. And for him to just instinctively know they could seriously hurt someone if they wanted to, details like these or those similar are found in a lot of cryptid encounters. What do you think about this story? And what would you do if you saw a bird that size? The next story comes from a poster who encountered not just a Thunderbird but also a UFO shortly after. She was encouraged to post her story online, and after reading some of the other encounters, she gathered the courage to share her own. She does not say where her story takes place. Her encounter took place about 8 or so years before she posted it online. She and her ex were out fishing in a boat one night with everything around them calm and peaceful. Now, she says that it's important to note that she had been sober for about 4 years at the time, so we can rule out any influence of drugs or alcohol. It was in the early morning hours, around 3 a.m. or so if she had to venture a guess, when the air around them suddenly turned cold. It was to the point where the OP had goosebumps on her arm. And then, out of nowhere, they heard a spine-chilling screech that sounded like a pterodactyl, accompanied by the flapping of wings. And there it was, this indiscernible thing, as she puts it, that appeared before them. She says it looked very prehistoric and that it definitely was not a bird. Her ex noticed it first, and as he fell silent, she followed his gaze and saw it too. It was towering over them, standing over 10 feet tall. The OP describes herself as not being small and weighing enough for 2 people, but she had an inexplicable feeling that whatever this thing was, it could carry her away effortlessly if it wanted to. The fear she experienced in that moment was paralyzing, rendering her unable to even let out a scream. In fact, she says it was almost as if she possessed the knowledge of this creature's intentions, an instinctual understanding that it wanted to attack her because she wasn't alone. However, she admits that there was no logical reason for her to feel that way. The couple hastily packed up their belongings and left. As they drove the 2 hours back to her house, they were shocked to see that it was almost 10 a.m. She couldn't recall the exact moment they encountered the creature, but she distinctly remembers it being dark. It was that time of year in the Midwest when the sun typically rose around 6 a.m., which only added to the time mystery. Even if it were close to dawn, time wouldn't magically jump ahead by 5 hours after just a 2-hour drive. She brought up the bizarre occurrence with her ex and he agreed that it was indeed weird. It was at that point, with her senses heightened, that she started noticing cars pulling over to the side of the road. Everyone was looking up, which drew her attention to the sky, where she saw an unmistakable, cliché-looking, she said, UFO hovering above them, matching the speed of their car. This much was obvious to her because a stationary object would have appeared smaller as the car moved away from it, but the UFO stayed right alongside them for at least 15 miles, even stopping when they did at intersections, only to resume its pace afterward. She ends by saying she posted her story in the forum where she did because she didn't think it belonged alongside paranormal stories due to the Thunderbird and UFO, plus the strange gap in time between the sighting of the two. I think if I was outdoors and I saw a prehistoric looking bird that was over 10 feet tall, I'd pack my belongings and get out of Dodge as well. No need to stick around and try to determine this thing's intentions, especially if it had noticed you. The way she describes the screech sounding like a pterodactyl and it looking prehistoric really makes me wonder if there could somehow be some left in the world. I'd be interested to know where her story takes place. But to also see a UFO in the same area not long after seeing this creature, that only adds to the bizarreness of this story. There have been many stories of encounters with cryptids that are either followed by or preceded by a UFO sighting in the same area. It really adds to the theory that the two are somehow linked. And then there is the time gaps, which happens in a lot of cryptid and UFO alien encounters. I also want to mention how people sometimes lose chunks of time as well. In some stories, people will be walking along in the woods, see a cryptid, then the next thing they know they are back in the parking lot or at the beginning of the trail with no recollection of how they got back there. It's baffling to think about how things like this can happen and what may be the cause of it. I'm not even going to try to venture a guess as to what it could be, but if you have any theories, be sure to leave them in the comments. What do you think about this one? And what do you think about the theory believing cryptids and UFOs are linked? With this next type of cryptid, I have heard of and seen accounts of people coming across the smiling or grinning man, but never even had the slightest thought this could be a cryptid. But when I saw it referred to as an Indrid Cold, I looked into it and found out that it actually is classified as a cryptid. According to the website Cryptid Wiki, Indrid Cold, commonly known as the Smiling Man or the Grinning Man, is an allegedly humanoid entity. The nickname comes from the being's tendency to smile at almost everyone that encountered him. It is said that he still visits West Virginia to this day. The Grinning Man is reported to be human-like in appearance, though he is commonly associated with UFO activity and is sometimes believed to be an alien. It is also believed to be possible that he is connected with the Men in Black. In his first sighting, he was described as being over 6 feet tall and wearing a reflective green suit with a black belt. He had a dark complexion and small, beady eyes set far apart. He was described as not having any nose, ears, or hair. In his second known encounter, his suit was said to be blue instead of green, but still retained its reflective property. Other than that, he was described as looking perfectly natural with slicked back hair, a coat with the top two buttons unbuttoned, and having pants lighter than the coat but still the same material. He was also described as being quite tan, though not dark, and looking like any normal human being. In the first documented sighting, according to the website, Indrid Cold was first seen on October 16, 1966, when two boys, Martin Mouse Minav and James Jimmy Yonkaitis, in New Jersey were walking on 4th Street when they saw a surreal figure standing near a fence. As they walked closer, the figure was a tall, bald man wearing a metal green suit who was staring right at them with a huge grin. The idiosyncratic man chased them until they got away from him. UFO sightings were also reported around the area. According to Nightmind, the boys only recalled the more frightening details of their encounter later on. They would recall that the man in the green suit was unusually tall and had unnatural facial features, such as the lack of ears and a nose. Even though most sources mention the New Jersey sighting, Indrid Cold and the Grinning Man could be completely different entities. The next story comes from a poster who didn't realize the encounter he had, which he calls absolutely terrifying, was actually a cryptid encounter. He does not say where his story takes place, just that it happened a year before he shared it online, and even typing it out gives him anxiety and flashbacks. The story, he says, is quite straightforward, as there are only 3 documented encounters that he knows of with the being he had the misfortune of crossing paths with. It all happened very quickly, but the impact it had on him was traumatic. Late one night, later than he intended to stay up, the original poster was in his room on his computer, which had his full attention. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of the Indrid Cold. He was peering out from behind a wall with only his hand and grinning face in sight. In a split second, the OP turned to get a better look, but the being had vanished just like that. The OP sat there frozen in fear for about 10 to 20 minutes. Eventually, he mustered up the courage to check behind the wall, but there was nothing there. The Indrid Cold was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had been a figment of the OP's imagination, leaving him believing it was some kind of hallucination. In the comment section of this story is another encounter shared by a user who had something similar happen to them. As he was growing up, there was always something peculiar in his window. He says it followed him from one home to another, beginning in a home that was on land with a disturbing history. He does, however, say that he isn't sure if it's all connected. He used to brush off the sightings of the Grinning Man as childhood paranoia, but to this day it sends shivers down his spine, unlike anything he has ever experienced. At random during the night, this being would appear at his window, watching him. He describes it as having long, bony fingers with the creepiest face imaginable. But the most ominous thing about this creature, according to the OP, was its smile. The closest comparison he has found is a Shinigami, which is the Japanese god of death or death gods that guide the dead toward the afterlife. But he does admit that even that doesn't seem quite right when delving into the actual folklore of this being. He ends his story by saying this creature is the one thing that, quote, sets him off, and he never talks about it to anyone. Yet even after decades, it still terrifies him. I couldn't imagine catching a glimpse of someone out of the corner of my eye in my home. But for it to be someone with a creepy grin on their face would be absolutely terrifying. More so recently, I've heard of and covered stories where these beings seemingly come into people's homes. I hope this is just an anomaly and not the start of a disturbing trend. If I were the OP, I'd be left traumatized too if I saw something like that. I would like to add here that it very well could have been just a hallucination like he ended up believing it might have been. But the lasting impact it had on him and the trauma he deals with to this day makes me think otherwise. As for the commenter story, to have something looking in your window and grinning at you like that would be horrifying. But for it to follow you from home to home? I've done stories on this channel documenting the same thing, with cryptids seemingly attaching themselves to someone and following them no matter where they go, even if they move homes. I can't say I blame him for being set off by the mere mention of this thing. That would have been very traumatizing to have something like that with an unsettling grin on his face looking in your window watching you. How would you react if you saw something watching you from around the corner or in your window with a creepy smile on its face? The final story of this episode comes from Iowa, where a poster had a disturbing encounter on Halloween in 2020. Her story takes place in Mount Vernon, Iowa. Mount Vernon is located in Linn County in the eastern part of the state. It is just to the southeast of Cedar Rapids and is part of the Cedar Rapids Metropolitan Statistical Area. Mount Vernon has a population of 4,527 as of the 2020 census. The original poster was walking home on Halloween from a friend's house when she noticed a man in a suit and tie staring at her from across the street. He caught her eye due to how he was walking, which she describes as very fancy, and because his gaze was intently fixed upon the darkness ahead of him. Initially, she assumed he had indulged in a bit too much of a certain recreational substance and continued on her way. However, her instincts kicked in when he decided to walk across the street. She knew then that something was off, being that there was an unsettling aura about this man. The OP describes herself as a petite woman, just 5 feet tall, and says her only real skill in a fight was speed, so she did not hesitate to run away. The one thing she noticed about him was the maniacal grin on his face. Later that night, her roommate believed she spotted someone outside their window, except their apartment was on the 4th floor. At first, she dismissed the encounter as someone's attempt to scare her on Halloween, but after discovering other Grinning Man stories, she can't help but wonder if there was something more sinister at play that night. When I first read this story, I too thought that it could have been someone just trying to scare someone on Halloween just like the OP did. But then I read the part where she described the man's unnatural aura and his maniacal grin. And then the part where her roommate thought she saw someone looking in their window later that night. Both of these things fit with Indrid Cold. And it wouldn't be the first time a cryptid was able to get to and look into a window that was on the 2nd floor or higher. But how they would do so is anyone's guess. I have to say these Indrid Cold or Grinning Man stories are some of the creepiest I have come across. There's nothing quite as unsettling as someone with a creepy smile on their face just watching you. What would you do if you found yourself in this situation? Also, what do you think of the Thunderbird and Indrid Cold? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.